Good evening. I'm Patrick Woodcock, President and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. The Maine State Chamber of Commerce represents thousands of employers across our state, representing different industries, small and large, who are all focused on creating a business climate that creates economic opportunity for Mainers and improves our state's competitiveness. We are pleased to present tonight's debate in partnership with New Center Maine and appreciate both candidates running for public office. We look forward to a constructive and substantive discussion. Maine businesses and the electorate deserve to hear candidates' priorities as they vie to represent Maine's 2nd congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you for engaging by listening to tonight's debate. Please familiarize yourself with the policy issues that affect you, and please remember to vote.
And good evening and welcome to New Center Maine's Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum. I'm Rob Caldwell. For the next hour, you're going to be hearing from the two candidates running for the U.S. House of Representatives in Maine's 2nd District. They are Democratic incumbent Jared Golden and Republican challenger Austin Theriault. Jared Golden, who is from Lewiston, served in the U.S. Marines, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, before working for Senator Susan Collins on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and then winning a seat in the Maine legislature. He has served in the U.S. House since first elected in 2018. Austin Theriault, who is from Fort Kent, was a NASCAR driver who later turned to training and managing new drivers in racing. He has served one term in the Maine House of Representatives. We're going to spend the next hour trying to get a good idea of where these two candidates stand on the issues. We'll be looking for specifics, we'll be looking for their solutions to problems, and we'll be looking to stay away from canned talking points. The candidates will each make a closing statement at the end of the hour. So let's turn now to our forum. Thank you both for coming in. It's good to have you here. We appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Let's start with what the polls tell us is the number one concern of people in the 2nd District, and that is the high cost of living. Now, inflation certainly has come down. That battle appears to be won, but many people are still struggling to get by financially every day, every week. Let's start with this question. What specific concrete steps can the federal government take that will help address people's problems with the cost of living?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us on. And I want to just take a second to say we're thinking about the people on the west coast of Florida that are going to be affected by the hurricane coming. Very, very tragic. In terms of the economy, what I believe is driving the high rates of inflation, certainly over the past couple of years, was the high cost of energy. What the federal government did with passing legislation to invest in forms of energy that are very expensive, like wind and solar, I think has certainly driven the grocery prices to go up. Anything related to the production of goods has gone up, certainly labor's gone up. What I'd like to see is us really invest in cheaper forms of energy. I know right now there's conversations about cheaper forms of energy that are clean, such as nuclear. I think we need to look at that as a potential solution over the long run. But in terms of short-term solutions, we also need to look at keeping taxes low and continue to cut wasteful government spending so that the Federal Reserve can continue to cut interest rates. Federal Reserve has raised interest rates because of the out-of-control wasteful spending, and that's something we certainly have to look at.
Would you favor the construction of a nuclear power plant in Maine?
I don't think we're able to answer that question yet. I know that there's certain parts of the country where they are restarting some of these facilities, but that's something that we might be able to look at. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there.
All right, Jared Golden, same question. What can be done by the federal government, concrete, specific steps that would address the high cost of living?
Well, just starting by addressing inflation, Rob, certainly I was concerned about high levels of spending. As you know, I supported the CARES Act, what we call CARES 2.0 during COVID in 2020. Of course, when we got into 2021 and the American Rescue Plan was put forward by the Biden administration, I thought it was too much spending too soon, and I actually warned it could be inflationary, and so I voted no. I was the only Democrat to vote that way, unfortunately, and I still stand by that vote. I do think that it helped drive inflation. It's the same reason in part why I oppose Build Back Better. Reducing government spending will help put pressure downward on inflation when you're in an inflationary environment like we were. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I opposed those bills but supported the Inflation Reduction Act, which did reduce government spending. And then again, in this Congress, I've really focused on reducing even more our projected budget deficits. So we had the debt ceiling default crisis in the summer of 2023, early 2023. And the deal that we actually ended up putting together actually reduces the projected deficit. I think that's a good thing. You mentioned that inflation is getting better. I wouldn't say that it has, that we've won by any means. Prices are still higher than they were, but the Fed has acknowledged that inflation is more under control. And so they're bringing down interest rates. That's going to help with costs today. So lower loans for businesses, for homes, for cars, that's all good.
All right, I want to get to federal debt in a few minutes,
sure.
But I want to address something that's related to the high cost of living, that's part of the high cost of living. And it's a serious problem in not every town in the 2nd District, but in many towns in the 2nd District, and that is the extraordinarily high cost of housing, particularly in relation to people's incomes. How can the federal government address that? Are there specific steps that Congress and the President could take that would address the problem of such expensive housing?
I think we need more supply to meet potential demand, especially with interest rates coming down. And actually, I think it's more of a local state issue. I'd like to see more deregulation that'll make it easier to build homes in a more cost-effective manner. At the federal level, most of the discussion about housing has to do with tax credits, Rob. And while those are fine for their own purposes, I think if you want to unleash the industry that is going to be building these homes, you got to look at the regulatory side, and that's usually a local and state issue.
All right, Austin, do you see it as a local and state issue, or are there things that the federal government can do to address unaffordable housing?
Well, I think every level of government needs to take a look at this right now. Just for example, and it's being talked about, Senator Collins brought it up, we've got about 300 houses being used right now to grow illegal marijuana, and those particularly are in rural Maine. I'm glad to see that the feds are now getting involved, but this has been going on for some time. They were buying houses sight unseen with cash. A lot of those folks from New York were buying them up, and this is a criminal racket, and we certainly have to address that. But interest rates, how did we get here? A couple of years ago, interest rates were fairly low, so somebody could take out a loan and make that and recoup that. If you're a local investor trying to build a 10-unit or 10 or 20-unit complex, it's very hard to see the return on investment. That's why I think we've seen at the state level, Maine Housing's gotten more involved. I like to see that increase, but once again, now we're turning this into a state issue. But driving down wasteful inflationary spending, I think, drives every part of the economy. The price of lumber, right? The price of anything to build a home right now is 40–50% more than it was just a couple years ago. And once again, we live in a free market, and costs will dictate whether or not people want to make these investments.
All right, we've been talking about the budget, about federal spending, and you both have indicated that you want to bring federal spending down. We have, as you both know, an enormous federal deficit. It's running at about $1.9 trillion a year. The federal debt is around $35 trillion a year. Both of these have numbers that just keep going up. The arrows are just pointing up. The problems are going to get worse. And economists say that this is unsustainable. It's a really tough problem, and it's going to require real political courage from Congress and the President to address it in an effective way. Austin Theriault, what would you do to address these soaring budget deficits?
Well, first of all, just to reiterate the problem, like in any home's budget, you can't spend more money than you take in. And right now, the federal government's been doing that for many years. And both Republicans and Democrats have said they were going to solve the problem. I remember, watching debates back in 2012, and they said we're going to solve this issue. Now we're actually spending more money on the interest of the national debt than we are on defense spending.
So what's the solution?
So one of the solutions is going to be zero-based budgeting. Every budget cycle, I believe these federal agencies need to come to the American people and certainly come to Congress with a zero budget. Start with zero, and then prove to us that this money needs to be delegated for this area, whether it's if it's one item versus another item, because we know over every budget cycle, and we've seen this with the state government here recently, because they're going to be experiencing an over $1 billion budget shortfall in the coming budget cycle. We've seen that when you start from the same amount of spending, there's no incentive. So it's creating the incentive with zero-based budgeting for the bureaucrats to start cutting spending.
Would you do
and it has
that
to
with,
be
for
wasteful.
instance, the military budget? Would you do that with Medicare, where inflationary pressures drive these higher?
No. So proposals
Well,
have...
those are two of the big programs, though, with the interest on the federal debt, which you can't just make go away. You can't have that at zero-based budgeting. If you're not going to do it with defense, you're not going to do it with Medicare, then that just leaves you with really a small sliver of the budget.
We have to start somewhere. That mentality has led us in this direction to where people say, oh, it's not that much, it's not that much. Well, I guarantee you over decades it does add up. Now, the interest on the national debt, because of interest rates going up, we taxpayers are responsible for that. So in some ways, when in previous discussions we've had, I've attacked the inflationary spending coming out of Washington, D.C. and things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which had nothing to do with inflation, it had to do with a green energy agenda. That's driven the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. And now we're paying more to service the debt. So this is a complex issue.
It is a complex issue, and I want to let Jared Golden weigh in. How can Congress and the President really, with some degree of effectiveness, address these spiraling budget deficits?
Well, actually, the Fed just lowered interest rates. And that's in part because of the work that I've been a part of in Congress to reduce federal spending, which we've now done consistently for about a year now, a year and a half, actually. Some of the things that you can do, Rob, and I put out a plan.
Overall federal spending has not declined.
It is coming down relative to its projected gap.
That's not a decline.
Yeah, it is actually working, Rob. So, here are your proof points. For starters, the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't just about energy. It was also about healthcare costs. Part of those healthcare savings for individuals here in Maine, like seniors, would be price negotiations over drugs, which is going to save the federal government money, so that we're going to be paying less for prescription medications under the Medicare program, and also seniors are going to be experiencing those savings in their everyday lives. It's going to save Medicare about $200 or $300 billion over 10 years. That's an example of a savings on federal spending. You can also bring in revenue. For instance, you could tax millionaire and billionaire households. You could raise taxes on the many U.S. multinational corporations that are paying 0 to 1 or 2% on their corporate tax rate, unlike businesses here in Maine that generally are paying the 21% rate. So you can close tax loopholes, bring in more revenue. You could do things like tariffs, something both Austin and I have said we support. You could take the revenue from that and you could commit it to reducing the federal deficit and our federal debt. Or you could use it to reduce taxes. There's any number of things you could do.
Let me turn to Austin Theriault on taxes. Are there any taxes that you would consider raising?
No, I don't think we have a tax problem. I think we have a spending problem. Every time this comes up, it's used as a political weapon. We look at businesses in Maine. I know businesses personally that have benefited from lower taxes. They've been able to hire more people during that era when the economy was low inflation, when we had low unemployment. We had people hiring. I mean, economic growth was spurred in this country. So I think that we can have discussions about how to grow our way out of this issue. Now, if somebody is illegally taking, using the IRS tax code to illegally get around paying taxes, that's a problem. But the people I know and the businesses that I know are small family-run businesses, and they are paying their fair share. In fact, we need to look at supporting them, cutting regulations, and lowering the cost of energy. So not only small businesses, but families can stay here in the state of Maine, and they're not run out from inflation. And then Jared's mentioned interest rates have gone down. But that is on top of very high interest rates for a sustained period of time. And inflation has gone down to 2 or 3%, but that is cumulative. So we've experienced a time where people are paying literally 30 or 40% more, and that adds up at the end of the day. So you can't say we've made a lot of progress. We have a lot of work to do.
Everyone feels that we all pay our fair share of taxes, but the fact is that the government spends about $1 on programs for every 75 cents that it takes in. So Americans are getting a lot more government than they're paying for. Doesn't something have to give? And it has to be either significant cuts in programs or increases in taxes. Do you disagree with that premise?
Well, no, we've already agreed about that, Rob. He says he doesn't agree. I'm part of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, a group of Dems and Republicans in the House that have called for a fiscal commission. And I've stood with conservatives like Jody Arrington, who's in chair of the Budget Committee, where we've agreed that if we're going to do something about the federal debt and the federal spending deficit, we're going to have to do everything from raising taxes. And I agree that middle class people shouldn't be paying more in taxes, so we got to raise it on the wealthiest of individuals, millionaires and billionaires, corporations, U.S. multinational corporations, many of whom use legal loopholes that shouldn't be in the tax code
Would you
to bring
oppose
in
higher
more
taxes
revenue.
on those groups, on millionaires, on multinational corporations? You'd oppose higher taxes for them?
Taxes are good at the rates they're at now. In terms of cutting taxes, once again, if somebody's illegally using the tax code for their own benefit and it's breaking the law, we need to go make sure we go after them. But once again, this is a spending issue. This is not a taxation issue. And I think you'll ask people back home, they know the government spends wildly. Look at what's going on right now at the border. Housing illegal immigrants, giving them benefits at the backs of taxpayers. You say that that's not a huge issue, but it is. It adds up. Now I remember when commissions have been proposed before, everybody says, "Oh, let's put a commission together and figure out how we're going to cut spending." This has to be a bipartisan solution. But a commission, when we had commissions years ago and nothing's happened, to me, is more symbolic of a Washington that's broken.
Let's look at a somewhat related issue, although it is separate, and that is the future of Social Security. Social Security is not paid for with income taxes, it's paid for with payroll taxes. As you both know, the trustees of the Social Security system have said that in about a decade, the system will not be taking in enough money to meet its obligations, and that it would be looking at reductions in benefits of roughly 18%. This is only a decade out. You both know how many elderly people there are in Maine who rely on Social Security. So this leaves three options: reductions in benefits, higher retirement age, or higher payroll taxes for workers. This is the only way to solve the problem, the experts say. What would you do?
Well, Austin's already said that he doesn't want to raise taxes, so he's taken one option off the table. He's signed the Grover Norquist no tax pledge. That's a big problem for Social Security. So what I would say is right now on payroll taxes, people stop paying in when they start making $168,000. They pay on everything before that, but if you make $300,000, you pay nothing on $168,000 to $300,000. There are people in this country that make millions per year, and they're not contributing any longer. And if we would that's called the cap on contributions. If we would just eliminate that cap and say you're going to pay in on every dollar you earn the same as working class people do, we could eliminate 75% of the trust fund shortfall right there without any reductions or any new contributions coming from the working class.
Austin Theriault, what would you propose of those three options again?
Well, I disagree that there's only three options, right? I think that in previous discussions I've had, and as I've talked to employers who are particularly small businesses in the 5 to 10 employees, they'd like to see an expanded workforce. We need to get more people into the workforce, people who have been on the sidelines. We know workforce participation rates are a lot lower now than they've ever been. So that's symbolic, I think, of an economy that's not working for everybody, where people actually make a calculation and say, look, it's going to be better if I don't enter the workforce. So we need to look at reforming programs so that when people want to enter the workforce, when people want to add hours if they'd like to because they want to move up in the economic ladder, that we make sure we don't just cut their benefits to zero. It has to be a progress. And as you do that, you will get more people into the workforce. Because I've had voters tell me they cannot afford to go back to work because what they'd make, they wouldn't be able to make up. It's not paying enough wages, the opportunities are not there, they have to pay for childcare, they have to pay for other expenses, and so there are people that are sitting on the sidelines. That's how we strengthen Social Security, by getting more people paying into the system.
Would that really work in Maine with its predominantly elderly population? Are you really going to get more people into the workforce?
I believe it is, and it's not just Maine. This is a national problem. Yeah.
We talked about childcare. You just mentioned childcare, and that's something that I wanted to bring up. Obviously, it's a really tough time now for a lot of parents who are raising kids. Austin Theriault, what can the federal government do to help make it easier for parents to raise children?
Well, we need to start by lowering the cost of living, which is what we've been talking about all night, right? As wages have gone up, they haven't kept up with the cost of living increases. So real wages have gone down over the course of the past several years, unlike during the Trump administration where real wages were going up. In terms of regulations, I think this is more of a state level issue. I did support a bill in the House, which ended up getting defeated in the Senate, which would have made it a little easier for folks in rural areas to get access to childcare. There is a model that's being utilized across the country, and certainly in Maine we've seen where businesses are partnering with nonprofit organizations, so it becomes a public-private partnership because it's good for businesses to be able to have a place for their workers' children to be able to go. It helps everybody, right? And so those are areas where I think the private sector and the public sector can work together to expand childcare.
Jared Golden, childcare, that's obviously one part of the solution, but again, the question, what in general can the federal government do that really makes a difference in making it easier for parents to raise children?
Well, I've supported like a multi-million-dollar earmark right out of the federal budget into a community, Skowhegan, where there's a partnership similar to what Austin talked about, where we have public dollars going into building a new school, and they're going to build a child care facility right next to it, right on the school premises. That's a public-private partnership. Local businesses are putting money into that, but I also brought money to help with the construction of it. So there's one local solution. At the federal level, there's the child tax credit, which I think is very poorly targeted. The Republican 2017 tax law actually changed the eligibility from around 150K up to like 440K. Families making $440,000 don't need help raising their children. And so I think if we were to better target that program towards real working middle class families, and instead of having it be a tax credit, turn it into a monthly cash benefit, would be something that would help them better afford whatever they want to do with it, whether that be food on the table, child care costs, whatever it may be, but let's trust people to make smart decisions for themselves rather than wrapping it into the tax code, particularly when it's so poorly targeted.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with our Voice of the Voter candidate forum. We're talking to the second district candidates, Jared Golden and Austin Theriault. Back with more right after this. And welcome back to our New Center Maine Voice of the Voter candidate forum. We are talking with the second district candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives, Democratic incumbent Jared Golden and Republican challenger Austin Theriault. Let's turn to the topic of abortion. We all know that the U.S. Supreme Court repealed or overturned, I should say, Roe versus Wade, and that has created great uncertainty and upheaval in this country regarding the availability of abortion. We've got a question from one of our viewers, and this is from Mo in Bangor, which simply says, what will you do to codify abortion rights in Congress? Jared Golden?
Well, I'm a co-sponsor of legislation that would codify Roe v. Wade and put it into federal law. And that's the best way to overturn what the Supreme Court did when they overturned those protections. My voting record makes clear that I am 100% pro-choice. That's my voting record speaks pretty plainly. But I think that we know what we have to do at the federal level. And Austin is pro-life. His voting record in the State House has made clear that he's in favor of restrictions on reproductive health freedom for women and their right to choose an abortion. And he doesn't think it's a particularly important issue. We debated Thursday night. He ended that discussion by saying, let's move on to talk about the issues that matter. For over 50% of voters in this state who are women, I think this is a very important issue.
Austin Theriault, same question. What would you do or not do to codify abortion rights if you were a member of Congress?
Well, first of all, I'd push back on what Jared says. He knows he's taking my comments out of context. This isn't a very sensitive issue. I lost a middle sibling because my mother had an issue with her pregnancy, and so I understand it's super important for a lot of people to make sure that they feel like they have a good relationship with their doctor. I am pro-life, as Jared mentioned, but I'm not in favor of a federal legislation or a federal ban. I would not support that. This has been talked about before in the general election. What I was referring to is that there are issues where we do agree more on. And because this is now going to the states and it's going to voters to decide this issue, that's where it belongs.
You say you're pro-life. The tradition has been for members of Congress who are pro-life to support laws that limit abortion. But you want to stay away from it, leave it in the hands of the voters? Why is that your approach?
Because that's what the voters are deciding around the country right now, Rob. this is not a one-size-fits-all issue as much as the media and as much as some politicians like to make it. This is a complicated issue, and at the end of the day, America will see its way through this. We'll see its way through this moment of division in our history, and hopefully coalesce and discuss issues that the voters find is important to them.
Any further comment on this, Jared?
Well, I think at the federal level, because we see so many states now restricting abortions, sometimes at like 6 weeks, which is almost like a de facto ban for many women. I think that the Congress could take actions and set a floor of protection at a minimum for millions of women around this country who have basically lost their freedom of choice. And so I do think that there's a role at the federal level to at least say, you got to have some level of protection. And I've asked Austin before if he would at least support that floor of protection. Like, would it be 15 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it would be? You would think for those millions of people in many states around the country who are losing this right, they'd like to have someone in Congress who's going to try and make sure that those protections are in place.
There are states that have adopted a ban on abortions after 6 weeks. Many women don't even know they're pregnant at that stage. Would you support a 12-week or a 16-week limit?
I'll just say it again, Rob. I don't support any federal legislation. This is a states' rights issue, and the voters are deciding.
All right, let me move on to the topic of guns. And I'm going to at least start this from kind of a different angle, maybe, from the way the question is often framed. The rate of gun deaths in the United States is dramatically higher than in similar countries. It's about 7 times what the rate of gun deaths is in Canada. It's more than 300 times what the rate of gun deaths is in the United Kingdom. So let me just put out the question to start. Why do we have so much gun violence in America?
Well, it's a sensitive issue once again. We're seeing right now that a lot of drivers of gun deaths are from suicide. And we know there's also gang-related deaths going on across the cities here in America. And in terms of the Second Amendment, Rob, this is being discussed right now because this is important to voters across the 2nd District. They want somebody who's going to do a couple things. They want somebody who's going to defend their Second Amendment rights. They want somebody who understands that Maine has a long history of law-abiding gun ownership. There's a lot of hunters, sportsmen, people who want to be able to protect themselves and their families living in the 2nd District. And on this, my record's clear. I am supported by the sportsmen, hunters, folks like Sam and Gun Owners of Maine have received A. Jared's received failing grades on those issues because he's made this a political issue. It's not the guns. Guns are dangerous in the hands of bad people, Rob.
But I want to go back to this issue of why the United States is such an outlier. Why is the level of gun violence in this country so much higher than it is just across the border in Canada? Because if we don't understand the nature of the problem, then how are we going to address it? So that's why I posed the question.
So it sounds like you're asking, why is there so much violence in America? Why are people more prone to act violently? Why is there more gang-related activity?
Why are there more gun deaths in this country? Why are there more gun deaths in this country?
Rob, why is there more suicide in America? And I'm glad you asked that question because it brings up the fact that we have a mental health crisis in America, and that is the underlying issue that I think we have to address. Not go after the Second Amendment, which Jared did. He flip-flopped on the Second Amendment. He now supports, I don't really know because you've changed it a few times, a gun registry, some sort of ban of weapons. And I know voters that feel like he turned his back on an important part of the Constitution that they support.
Ask one more question, just to try to get in on this. Do you think that the rates of mental health, problems in the United States are more than 300 times higher than they are in the United Kingdom?
Sounds like we're having a debate, but I like the conversation because we have a real issue of mental health in this country. Try to talk to a family that hasn't been affected by their kid getting bullied in school. Try to talk to somebody that says access to mental health here in rural Maine is easy and accessible. Try to talk to somebody that feels like the system right now is taking care of everybody and quickly. And I will say that you're going to have a hard time finding somebody that says we don't have a real issue with access to mental health. And our society is experiencing loneliness, experiencing depression and anxiety at high levels, and people feel isolated and alone. And that is increased coming out of COVID because of what happened with people feeling isolated.
And bring Jared Golden into the conversation. Why are the rates of gun deaths so much higher, so much dramatically higher in this country than in other comparable countries?
I actually don't think it's a fair question to ask either one of us to tell you why we have higher gun violence in this country relative to others. But you are asking questions that are fair about gun safety, about public safety. My record in the legislature for 4 years and then 6 years in Congress has always, I think, been very nuanced, where I've sought to balance the individual protection of the Second Amendment with the high duty of looking after public safety. And my record reflects that. Now, I've got people like Craig Poulin, who's supporting my reelection, former chief of the Maine State Police. He was the last president of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. He recently stepped down, and he's out there telling people he trusts me on the Second Amendment, and he knows that I will work and strive as hard as I can to keep our communities and our families safe to the best of my ability. And it takes that nuanced approach. Now, I will say, Austin will say, as a candidate, that the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, that it is unimpeachable, cannot be touched. In his personal life, he knows it's more complex than that. He's actually called the police because he saw someone standing on their front porch with an AR-15, and he called the police and told them that he was just wanting them to check it out. So clearly he understands that there's a discrepancy here. That type of action in his private life doesn't match with what he says as a candidate for Congress. This is a tough issue. You've got to be serious about it.
And we'll step back from the cause, the root problem, since frankly neither of you wants to address that. But let me ask you, let me follow up with this question. What, if any, changes on the federal level would you like to see in gun laws in this country?
Well, first of all, let me respond. There was a lot mentioned in terms of making accusations without any context. Yes, I am a law-abiding citizen and believe that when you see something where somebody may be using a gun unlawfully, or there may be a confrontation that leads to violence, it's important to notify law enforcement. How that's connected to confiscating guns or a gun registry, to me, is completely separate. I think it's a distraction from the nuanced point of view that we should have had after the terrible tragedy that we experienced last year, where we really should have taken a step back and looked at why this happened, what failures in the system occurred that allowed this to happen, and gone after addressing those instead of going after the Second Amendment. And he made public statements that he wanted to ban certain types of weapons. He wanted a gun registry a few weeks later and then walked that back. I think that that's the real issue we have to discuss.
All right, I want to go back to the question I asked you. What changes, if any, would you like to see happen to gun regulations on the federal level?
I wouldn't support any right now. I think this is an issue that is being addressed at the state level, and I think that this conversation is getting away from the real root of the issue, and that's violence and people experiencing difficulties in their lives. And when they need help, we need to make sure they can get access to it.
The police record, by the way, made no reference to any kind of action or problem that would have led you to believe that there was some kind of crime about to be committed. It was just a guy on his own property with an AR-15. Austin says that the response to the shooting in my hometown of Lewiston should be about mental health. And then when the state legislature put together a mental health package for Lewiston and Auburn, and for the victims and for their families, he voted against it.
What changes would you like to see on the federal level regarding gun regulation?
Well, like I said, I've had a balanced approach. There's been a lot of proposed gun regulations I voted against because I thought that they went too far for no good reason, infringing upon people's Second Amendment rights. And it's true, after the shooting, I said we need to take a good hard look at these most lethal of firearms. I've never supported a gun registry, that's not true. But I have said, perhaps for those of us that want to own these firearms, in recognition of how lethal they are, some kind of permitting system, some higher threshold, so that we know that the people that have them are of good character, of good mental health, aren't addicted to drugs, and are in a good, solid state.
Let's turn to another topic. It was 1 year ago today that Hamas and other militant groups attacked Israel. What has unfolded in the last 12 months has been an epic tragedy. The United States' approach to what is happening in Israel, in Gaza, now in Lebanon, Iran also a player here. Do you support in general what the U.S. approach has been, or do you think there ought to be changes in the way the U.S. deals with this issue?
Look, I went some years ago in 2002 in response to 9/11, I left Maine, I went down to North Carolina, I put on a Marine Corps uniform. I went over to the Middle East to fight terrorist organizations, similar to Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization, Hezbollah, the same. I have fought against these types of people on behalf of this country. I've now spent 6 years on the Armed Services Committee. When it comes to national security, I know what I'm talking about. And I'm absolutely supportive of what we've done in the United States in response to what happened a year ago in that terrorist attack against Israel. I've supported every package that's gone forward to their military to make sure they have the resources they need to carry out the fight against these terrorist groups, both of which also target the United States.
Austin Theriault?
Well, you know, Rob, this is something that I actually think there's more bipartisan support for than almost any other issue, and it's, you know, the ability for Israel to protect itself and defend itself. I mean, we all watched what videos and stuff were coming out just 1 year ago from this attack. You know, oftentimes think of what would it be like if this happened here, similar to a 9/11 style of attack. And, you know, once again, I think bipartisan support for Israel, making sure they have the aid that they need. And in terms of, you know, specifically looking at some of these terrorist organizations, we know that they have a very low regard for life. I mean, they have spent aid on things like building up their weapon stores, building up defenses, instead of it going to humanitarian aid. And I think that's the sort of the level of the type of organizations we're dealing with. And I'm glad that there is action being taken by Israel right now to go and address the root of the problem.
It's been about 2.5 years now since Russia invaded Ukraine and started that war in an unprovoked attack. Do you want Ukraine to win that war?
Yes, I do. And in terms of making sure that that money that American taxpayers are spending to ensure that that happens, there needs to be accountability at the same time. You can want to make sure that Ukraine's successful, make sure that there's not an expansion of pressure put on NATO around that area, but you can also ask the hard questions to make sure that that money's being spent usefully, properly, and that there's no waste and fraud going on.
Do you want Ukraine to win that war?
Yes, and we have boots on the ground who are making sure that there's accountability for any U.S. aid going to that country. And the fact of the matter is, even though Austin says he wants them to win that war against Russia, when I voted for the last package that sent aid to both Ukraine and Israel, Austin criticized that vote. He said he wouldn't have voted for it. That kind of vote really matters. If past is prologue, what I've said about Ukraine, we've looked back at the past with the type of Russian aggression we see. It would be cheaper for us today. And these arms are being made by American workers in American manufacturing facilities. Those are American jobs. It is cheaper to send bullets and arms to Ukrainians to win this fight for themselves, rather than risk Russia's success, which could lead to an escalation of war in Europe, where a future Congress might have to have a hard conversation about young American men and women going to war in Europe once again. We don't want that. We need to make sure Ukraine is successful in this fight.
What has kind of unfolded is that the United States and its allies in Europe have provided Ukraine with the arms it needs to basically fight this war to a stalemate. That there are critics who say that Ukraine is not getting the arms it needs for victory. Do you think that more arms ought to be going to Ukraine, that the United States needs to increase its commitment to Ukraine?
Well, once again, I don't know the exact answer to that. We have to make sure that we rely on some of the experts. And my comment to what Jared brought up was, I think that we need more oversight. We need to make sure that what is going on and what's being invested in Ukraine is going to make sure that the taxpayer is protected. We know what's going on right now with the hurricanes and the response and the lack of money. And it seems like there are some times when there's certainly a quicker response to other countries versus what we have, which is taking care of Americans here at home.
Final word on the Ukraine issue, if you want one?
Don't trust the experts, people like Jake Sullivan, who have nice degrees.
He's the national security advisor to the president right now.
He's never worn the uniform, he's never been in combat, and he has constantly talked about we need to just give him a little bit. I think leading to a stalemate. I've been a part of a bipartisan coalition of mostly veterans in Congress saying that we need to go all in. That is how wars are fought. We have pushed for F-16s, we have pushed for HIMARS, we've pushed for Abrams tanks, At first, people like Jake Sullivan have said no. Ultimately, they've gotten to yes. And they should have been from the very beginning. So I would agree that the Biden administration has been way too slow in getting the tools into the hands of the Ukrainian warfighters to get out there and not just fight to a stalemate, but win.
I want to turn now to talk about climate change. We all know what happened on the coast of Maine last winter when back-to-back storms hammered the coast and caused millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. Right now, as we speak, the hurricane is headed toward the west coast of Florida right after another terribly destructive hurricane, and it looks as though this one has the potential to cause enormous damage and destruction. This is what scientists say is the result of global warming, and that we're going to see more of this in the future. What should not just America be doing, but what should America be doing to lead the world in addressing climate change?
That's a big question.
It is a big question. There aren't any easy questions in Congress, so there aren't many. So these are tough questions, so go ahead. Take a shot at it. No, I'm going to ask you, Jared Golden. You go first on this, please.
Sure. Look, I think it is a little naive to think that the United States alone can fix the entire planet. We could make certain changes, try and meet certain types of goals. The fact of the matter is, around the world, there are a lot of countries who are not going to meet them. So let's be honest about that. I think that this really leads into an energy discussion, and all of the above approach for the United States is what we took with the Inflation Reduction Act, where we put money towards and unleashing the power of American oil and gas production out of a recognition that that is a strength that we have, a resource that we have, and it can help keep energy prices down. But we also put investments into things like wind and solar, yes, things like nuclear. Energy should be produced here in the United States, and things like carbon capture can help with keeping oil and gas emissions out of the climate.
Well,
and investments in renewable energy, it's all the above.
That by increasing oil and gas production, that doesn't address climate change. Maybe it's a trade-off that cushions
this conversation
the economic
is all
blow.
about trade-offs, and so I am answering the question. I'm telling you what I would support in all of the above energy approach. I already know Austin's going to hit me about renewable energy. There is what he says in criticism of things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which did bring down the cost of gas at the pump and did make an investment in across-the-board energy if it is made here in the United States of America. But his voting record reflects something different. This is someone who stood here the other night and said that wind is always bad, that he will always oppose it. He voted for a power line right here in Maine that connects wind power to the main grid. I only point that out to show that his attacks have a bit of hypocrisy in them.
All right, let me address the question again, and that is, what should the U.S. be doing to address climate change, and what can it do to provide leadership in the world?
Well, this is an important issue, okay? Because what we've seen in Washington, D.C. is not actually solving the problem of climate change. There's a lot of talk, there's not a lot of actually getting results. We've seen China and India lead the world at pollution, CO2 emissions and whatnot. So I think if America's going to be a leader, it has to be a leader on going after those countries that are basically using dirty energy to produce cheap goods that then they flood the U.S. market with. We need to go after that. Tariffs would be an option in that case. In terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, this is where I think Jared is cherry picking certain things in there to say that it was a good bill. This bill has led to not lower costs. This bill has led to higher costs for consumers right here in Maine. Go down the highway, go down a back road, and tell me you haven't seen a solar panel field. Those solar panel fields are being set up right here in Maine at only 10 or 20% efficiency. And who's paying for that? The ratepayers are subsidizing that, and it's coming because the Inflation Reduction Act put a lot of money out there, billions and billions of dollars, towards these big companies, primarily from out of state, coming into Maine and charging way over market price for electricity. That, in my opinion, is not a sound economic decision. It certainly is not lowering energy costs. And in terms of his comment about oil and gas, those permits that he's talking about are not even going to be adding to the supply of oil for 5 to 6 to 7 years after they're given in terms of permits, because it takes companies a long time to set these up.
How would you reduce carbon emissions then? What do you favor?
told you we have to make sure that we pressure China and India to reduce their output of emissions. And you know what? If they're not going to do it,
it's highly unlikely that other countries are going to do that if the United States does not do something as well.
The United States has been, Rob, the United States has been. The United States has been cutting their greenhouse emissions for a while. I mean, that line is leveled out, where China is just exploding. Every single month they're putting more and more coal-powered stations online. We talked about things like nuclear power in the United States. If you want clean power, that is the direction that you need to go. Not set up these subsidized solar and offshore wind setups that are costing people money and actually putting some industries out of business, like the lobster industry.
When I voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, gas was almost $5 a gallon. It's now down to about $3 a gallon. The law is working. Austin keeps talking about renewable energy. These solar fields he's talking about, the wind that's going on, like the one that he voted to support, those are all state level propositions, which he failed to stop in the state legislature. Now he says he'll go to Congress and stop it. Where I come from, if you fail, you don't get a promotion.
Comment on that. So,
last word on that.
Yeah, that's a great talking point, Jared. At the end of the day, the money to make sure that those solar panels can be financed is directly coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. So while it can be a state issue, it's also a federal issue. If those subsidies were not there and you had voted no on the Inflation Reduction Act and more people in Washington, D.C. had stood up and said that has to be amended, the money wouldn't be there for the expansion of these programs. Now, in some areas you can have wind and solar, and particularly solar, but in Maine, when it's 0 degrees out, it's a waste of money, and taxpayers are paying for it, ratepayers are paying for it. Have you opened up your electricity bill recently and seen it go up 2 or 3 times?
They're paying for it because of the way the legislature drafted it, and you failed to amend it. And now ratepayers are paying. That's a state legislature failure. And you're trying to pin it on me.
I'm not. I'm trying to pin the fact that you authorized almost $1 trillion over the next 10 years to be spent on these solar panel and EV infrastructure, the EV mandate that we fought back against at the state level.
We didn't fight. I testified in opposition. You didn't show up. I showed up to do your job.
Let's talk about
Let's talk about
the Inflation Reduction Act, because you don't like to mention that it's a bad bill. That authorized more and more money to be spent for the infrastructure that was mentioned as a reason that Maine should adopt the California clean air rules. So you have a lot to say in Congress in terms of energy policy, and it's unfortunate that you're not willing to say that the IRA was a bill that caused inflation, caused record spending, and blew up the budget.
Brought down prescription drug prices for seniors here in Maine, $35 insulin. It's going to save about $100 to $500 per senior starting on January 1 in their prescription medications. That's a huge, huge benefit, and it's a good reason to support a piece of legislation like that on top of the lower gas prices that it's responsible for.
All right, we're going to take our last break. We're going to be back with more with Jared Golden and Austin Theriault in just a moment. We're back in the final minutes of our New Center Maine Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum with the two candidates in Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Republican Austin Theriault and Democrat Jared Golden. Let's talk for just a bit about the 2020 presidential election. Did Donald Trump lose that election?
He did, and we have the result of that, which was record inflation, an international crisis spreading around the world. And I think at this point now, there are more important issues for us to talk about, such as immigration, which we really haven't touched on tonight. And I hope you're going to save some time for that before the end.
Just to be fair, I will ask you the same question. Did Donald Trump win the 2020 presidential election?
Donald Trump did not win the 2020 presidential election.
Here's what I wanted to get to with this question is differences over policy can be resolved. There are always differences over policy. But the question of whether the American democratic system continues to work is a different one. You're an enthusiastic supporter of Donald Trump. You have said that you are okay with Donald Trump winning. But the question is, how does the system survive? How does the system thrive if we have a presidential candidate who has set a precedent of refusing to accept the outcome of a free and fair election? What happens if that precedent becomes tradition?
Rob, I think, I don't know how much more clear I can be on that, in which is, the 2020 election, in my opinion, Donald Trump didn't win. But I really think that we should talk about immigration, because immigration is an issue.
Could you answer the question, please? Because this really is an important issue. It goes to the heart of democracy. The tradition in the United States for more than 200 years has been that candidates who lose acknowledge that they lost, and that has not happened in the last 4 years.
I've said repeatedly that we need to tone the rhetoric down in D.C. We need more balance and less extremism. And to be honest, the difference on the stage is I've said I don't agree with Donald Trump on some things. I don't agree with his style and his approach. But I said I'm going to vote for him because look at what happened with the economy. Look what happened with national security under his tenure. And Jared won't even say who he's supporting for president. He said he's not voting for Trump, which I guess leaves Kamala Harris. And he's not saying whether he supports her or not. So this is a binary choice here for people listening tonight. Do you want somebody who's going to say who they're supporting, who's going to say that they know that the choices may not be perfect, but at least tell the American people and the Maine people who
and
you're going to support?
I want to ask the same question to you. Why are you okay with a presidential candidate who is willing to set a precedent that he will not accept the outcome of a free and fair election? And will this precedent lead to the possibility that this becomes the new norm in American politics?
I'm okay if the people choose Donald Trump to be president, as I will respect the outcome if they choose Kamala Harris. I think that we have to look around this country at the 300 million plus people here, the men and women like myself who put on the uniform, swear an oath to the Constitution, to the Constitution. Right? Even in the Marines, I learned that you do not follow unlawful orders, that you stand up and do the right thing, right? That you put the mission and the institution above all else. I have great faith in the American people. We have built an institution here. Our founders built it. The checks and balances, the Congress, the executive branch, the judicial system. Yes, Donald Trump at times put stress on this, but it withheld all of that stress, and it proved that we can stand up to almost any kind of pressure, as long as the American people still believe in freedom and democracy.
I want to ask one more question before we get to closing statements. So this is one where you can give me a brief answer. Who is a member of Congress right now whom you admire?
Somebody specifically, probably not a household figure, but I met was Congressman Babin. He has roots. His ancestors come from Acadia, which is similar to where I came from, and so I look at him as somebody who came from very humble beginnings and was able to be quite successful.
All right, same question. Whom do you admire?
Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican House member from Pennsylvania, served in the FBI. Someone I've worked with very closely, repeatedly. We are the two most bipartisan voting members of Congress. We're actually very close when you look at the kind of infograph that shows voting behaviors. We're actually quite lonely in the middle, where we see such partisanship, both parties being very loyal to their parties. Brian and I break with our own parties very consistently.
All right, we're going to end up now with closing statements. You each get 1 minute, and according to the flip of the coin, Jared Golden, you go first.
Well, I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. I want to say I've been doing this job for 6 years now. We've been through 3 elections together. No matter what the attacks are from one election to the other, you know who I am. I know who I am. I'm not going to forget where I come from, and I'm going to continue being the same kind of member that I've been for the last 6 years. That's one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. I do it that way because I understand you and the way that Maine is. We are an independent, fair-minded people, and that's why I take that approach in Congress, and I'm going to keep doing it no matter what. And it doesn't come easy. I get a lot of criticism from both parties, but I think it's the right path to choose. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing to have your support. I'm asking for your vote on November 5th, and thanks again for tuning in.
Austin Theriault.
Well, thank you to the listeners tonight that may be tuning in for the first time as they decide who their choice for the next congressman is going to be. I am very proud to come from a rural part of the state of Maine, up in Aroostook County in the St. John Valley. Hardworking people, like many other areas around the state of Maine, where people feel lost, left behind, and forgotten. And that is going on too much these days in Washington, D.C. Too many people run for office, make great promises during campaign season, but when it comes time to making and delivering results for the Maine people in Congress, it doesn't actually work out good for you, the voters. So I'm asking for your vote this election cycle because I do believe we need a change. I believe more people are answering the question as to whether or not they're better off now than they were 4 or 6 years ago, or answering that question as a no. And I know we can do better. We need more representation, more aggressive representation. We have so many issues that we have to fix and address, but it's going to take aggressive leadership, not only during campaign season when people spend millions of dollars on TV to lie and mislead you, the voters, but during every single day on the ground, making sure that we can expand businesses, making sure families want to stay here in the state of Maine, making sure we can lower the cost of living, protect the border, and ultimately make a better, safer America, which we all know we deserve because you all work hard and we can do a better job. Congress is broken. It's time for a change.
That is the final word. Our hour has gone by. Thanks both for being here. We really appreciate it. Jared Golden, Austin Theriault, good of you to join us. And again, we'll have more of this debate that are going on in various forums between now and Election Day. And we just want to let you know this was our first News Center Maine Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum. We have 2 more to go. The one for the 1st District congressional candidates will be at 7 p.m. on October 17th. And the forum for Maine's candidates for the U.S. Senate will be on October 30th. So those 2 still to come. And again, Election Day is November 5th. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening.